Emily, or yours? Oops.
This is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom show, The Wake Up Call, on WCOM LP, Chapel Hill and Carrboro, 103.5 on your FM dial, or live streaming at WCOMFM.org. You can also watch the show on the People's Channel after a week's delay on Thursday night at 10 p.m., Friday morning at 6 a.m., or Tuesday at noon. The show will also be available on our YouTube channel, The Wilf Wake Up Call. I'm Miriam Schwinzer here with our host today, Miriam Thompson, and Emily O'Hare on the camera.
We're ready. Welcome, everyone. I'm Miriam Thompson. I'm a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. I'm also co-chair of the Abrahamic Initiative on the Middle East. And today, in the middle of impeachment proceedings, we hope to put the struggle for Palestine liberation from the yoke of Israeli occupation and colonization into the current political environment of impeachment, wars, growth of dictatorial regimes, and the desperate need to change our U.S. leadership to forge a more peaceful and just foreign policy that has long been part of WILF's history and social justice tradition. So I thought I'd start, why Palestine? The importance of Palestine, as I will begin to argue, is that few people know in this country that we spend $3.8 billion of our tax dollars in supporting the military, Israel's military occupation and colonization of Palestine. $3.8 billion of our money. Nobody has asked us for that kind of permission. We've had a Congress that has been donor-driven by many Israel allies, donor-driven by many of Israel's allies, which is true of other issues as well, donor-driven Congress. We've been trying to get to our own David Price Congress members and G.K. Butterfield to really bring them more aggressively and robustly on board. I should say that at least, and I think it's in large part because of the growth of understanding and support for Palestine among millennials, that we have seen at least a beginning of conversation in Congress around the issue of leveraging military aid. You don't stop the illegal occupation. You don't stop stealing Palestinian land. You don't stop bombing Gaza and murdering people on the border of peaceful protest, demanding the right of return. You don't stop putting children in cages, which is what's happening to Palestinian children, with no charges, by the way. They're put in Israeli prisons. All of those things we are paying for, supporting with our military dollars. So I want to just start with an incredible article, and I'm going to mention at the end important resources, because there's no way we're going to be capturing years of struggle against an occupation that goes back over 60 years in 1 hour or half or less. But I want people to continue the conversation. We have questions from our listeners that I'm going to go over. And the first one was why Palestine should be of interest. And as I explained, it starts with our $3.8 billion of tax dollars supporting a ruthless campaign that international human rights groups, faith leaders have condemned, but silence, mostly silence, among our congressional leaders. Until, as I said, I think that's changing with the support of more and more young people demanding an end to our support for the occupation. This is from Rama Kudami. Rama Kudami works for the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. I'm going to give you that again at the end as a really important resource, U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. As I write, says Rama, reports are rolling in about the latest round of Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip. You should know, by the way, that over the last 5 years, Israel has had massive bombing campaigns against Gaza that has been aimed at hospitals, what's left of Palestinian enterprises and business enterprises, and it just has left Gaza almost unlivable. The UN has claimed Gaza may be totally unlivable in the next couple of years. The latest rounds on the Gaza Strip, as I watch the stories of families that have lost their homes and children who have lost their parents, and as I see images of children walking through the rubble of a United Nations Relief Work Agency school, I forgot to say that, not only hospitals but schools they're bombing, that was damaged in yesterday's strikes east of Gaza City. It becomes all the more clear to me, nowhere is safe for Palestinians in the land that we think should be shared. Israel's recurring attacks on the Gaza Strip are part of its daily violence against Palestinians everywhere. This systemic violence includes the theft of Palestinian land and resources, mass incarceration of Palestinian men and boys, and this apartheid wall which tears through Palestinian lands and communities, and by the way, denies them from their historic olive groves. Against this backdrop of ongoing violence, 7 indigenous Black and Latinx organizers arrived in Palestine, and we're going to have more of a report, because when I mention millennials, Palestine, and this has gone on for decades, has been a very important area of solidarity among Black population, especially the what is it called? I'll think of it in a minute. But anyway, Black and Latinx populations that see the same thing happening. The same thing. Oop, I'm being told I have to adjust the mic. Closer to the mic? No.
You on this
This
side.
way. Ah, okay. All right, now you can all see me and I'm not being interrupted by a mic in my face. But anyway, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that's who I was thinking of, has historically, since the early 60s, been in support of Palestinian liberation and a decent space for Palestinians to govern themselves and to have a reasonable way of living. And by the way, because of their support for Israel, it's interesting to note, they were denied funding. They lost much of their funding. And in the end of the 60s, we no longer saw SNCC. It's very interesting. Even then, there were major funders that withdrew their support for this important Black liberation organization here in the U.S. because of their support for Israel. So I want to now go to the the Institute for Middle East Understanding. Just bear with me while I get their report. Before I go to the Institute, I want to start with Amnesty International. Amnesty International, you can get on their website, has talked about what has happened to Palestinian freedom of protest, often happening here, by the way. Increasingly we see University of in our own Chapel Hill, suppressing protest and dissent. We saw that last week when we interviewed Maya Little. Well, much worse is happening, of course, in Palestine. Military Order 101 prohibits political protests. Thousands have been arrested and thrown in jail just for exercising what we would consider any population's right to reasonable and peaceful protest. That's Amnesty. Now I'm going to try to get I'll get a few in a minute. This is the Institute for Middle East Understanding. In addition to what Amnesty has documented, what Human Rights Watch has documented, Palestine is on the the screen of every human right on the radar of every human rights organization. The only place where has there been silence and complicity has been in our U.S. government. Witness what I keep repeating, the $3.8 billion in basically military aid to support Israel's occupation. Here's what Institute for Middle East Understanding has said. imeu.org. Get out your pens and pencils. imeu.org. I mentioned earlier the U.S. campaign to liberate Palestine, and of course Amnesty International. You can go to Human Rights Watch, and we have massive documents, and I'll give you where you can get them from the UN. The Palestinian in the economy in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza is subject to severe restrictions imposed by Israel's occupying army, most notably the limiting of freedom of movement for people and goods and the theft of natural resources. Since 2007, Israel has imposed a draconian siege and naval blockade on Gaza that has been condemned as a form of collective punishment and illegal by the UN and human rights organizations, creating a deliberately man-made humanitarian catastrophe for the nearly 2 million Palestinians trapped in the tiny coastal enclave of Gaza. The quick facts. The Palestinian economy in the occupied territories is dominated by service and manufacturing industries and the government sector. The unemployment rate has skyrocketed. The numbers of Palestinians working inside Israel or in illegal Jewish settlements, approximately 127,000, many of whom are exploited as cheap labor. The GDP has vanished. GOPs per capita has vanished. Economic growth has vanished because of the siege, illegal settlements, and of course the occupation. The number of Palestinians living below the poverty line is now over more than half. The number of Palestinians in Gaza who are forced to rely on food aid to survive is way more than half the population. And it goes on and on. It is just, yes.
Oh,
good.
I wonder if you could give some background of how this happened in the first place and how it's come to this now.
Well, it's very interesting, and it brings in what has happened to Zionism. I mean, Zionism was in the 19th century an effort to find, in the midst of mass anti-Semitism, and of course in the Second World War, the horrific issue of 6 million Jews being cremated and dying in concentration camps. Mm-hmm. And so they sought to have a safe place. And of course they sought out what they thought of as their historic homeland in Israel. But not to displace another Semitic people, but rather to live in harmony with those who were occupying the land that they sought, namely Palestinians. Steadily, yes.
Was that the initial?
This was in the 19th century.
But this was defined as the initial. They would come there not to unsettle Palestinians, but to live with them somehow.
Well, you know, there's like mixed news. I mean, for some, it didn't matter to displace, and many Palestinians didn't have documentation to claim ownership over their land, and so it was expropriated by Jewish settlers. But there were certainly others that, in fact, were looking to share the land that each of the Semitic peoples declared as their history, right? Mm-hmm. Ownership over this land. Mm-hmm. Increasingly, however, as I mentioned, and it happened in it escalated from 1948 when the UN partitioned Palestine, some to the Israeli Jews escaping or those coming to Israel from Europe where they'd been exterminated and or imprisoned, and Palestine, the Palestinians who lived there. Steadily, however, and it ballooned in 1967 when Israel's occupation overtook Palestinian land. So whatever the UN divided, Israel increasingly absorbed and displaced Palestinians, stole land, stole water resources, which was critical, built a wall now that separates Palestine and Israel, like the wall that Trump is trying to build. I mean, this is part of again, I go back to our $3.8 billion and Trump and his wall. And I should say, by the way, the children in cages now, the Palestinian children that have been arrested and terrorized by Israel, which is really to subvert any future generations of protest, just like we're doing on our southern border, separating families and putting children in cages who are fleeing violence in countries whose dictators, by the way, our foreign policy has supported. So I'm hoping that answers, but I can't remember the great Jewish philosopher, and I should add, by the way, I'm part of the Jewish Voice for Peace, the Triangle Jewish Voice for Peace. That is also another place where people can look, a strong cadre of Jews that are protesting the Israeli occupation and often being called anti-Semites. It's no accident that the wonderful Palestinian Congresswoman from Detroit, Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, our wonderful squad, have been talking against the occupation, and have been dismissed as anti-Semitic, as well as other horrible epithets that they're being called. But I'll get to this extraordinary. I want to talk about this extraordinary because it answers your question. This extraordinary Jewish scholar and historian who lived and worked in Israel. And in 1953, not when Israel expanded its occupation, in 1953, he saw the dangers of the Israeli independent state and Zionist state in 1948. He saw the danger of what it was going to become, which was really an empire. This is a Jewish scholar and historian who then disavowed Zionism because it was no longer just an appeal to get land to save it from the horrible anti-Semitism in Europe. It was really an effort to build empire and a Jewish state. And not a Jewish state that originally perceived by Zionists and that he perceived, but a Jewish state that was going to be built on empire. I should also make sure I mention that Israel is the only nuclear power in the Middle East. You will never hear that in the media. They'll talk about Iran, that is not a nuclear power, that Obama signed an agreement with, that Israel bombed and was anxious in bombing Iran. I mean, that's why they're working with Trump. Why is Trump popular with Netanyahu, who is the outgoing prime minister in Israel, who lost 2 elections, but they haven't yet put in a reasonable government, whose defense minister talks about literally ethnic cleansing, when Somalian refugees, Jewish refugees from Somalia tried to come to Israel. I mean, this is becoming a racist state. They were treated like garbage, and fortunately the court eliminated some of the attacks on the Somalian refugees. But this is what the state of Israel, a democratic state, high hopes, all talk of democracy, what it has become under the present administration. And one can say, look at what's happening to our democracy under the present administration. So I wanted to move on to a very important document, which I hope we'll uncover, because I wanted to get some teachers to join us, and I couldn't get it on today's show, but I would like to encourage later how we educate our young people, not only to know our own history, and Emily and I were at the recent 1619 symposium sponsored by the Stone Center, the Sonia Haynes Stone Center. But how do we get our young people in their classrooms, which was a theme that we raised at the symposium, as well as understand what's happening in our foreign policy in Israel, in Bolivia, now that we have, we've overturned the elected government, who's calling it a coup. In Venezuela, we're starving Venezuela because they don't abide by our, the kind of politics that we enjoy. They're too socialist. All over. I mean, every one of them. Who is Trump? Let me shut off my thing. Who is Trump hanging out with? The Duertes in the Philippines, and the Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. By the way, military aid to Israel, but also military aid and contracts with our military. They're the ones who are profiting that Saudi Arabia is buying to destroy Yemen. So we have Palestine, we have Yemen that may not exist for very long. But I did want to have another program where we talk to teachers and young people about how we can transform our public school education so that young people come out knowing about our own history, what kind of foreign policy that is feeding war and the military right here. May I remind folks that in the late 50s, it was Eisenhower who warned us against the military-industrial complex. Well, we're still, our military our defense industry are exploding, and the only one profiting are not the people in this country. We could use the military, reducing military expenditures could pay for our health care, could pay for our infrastructure, could pay for our public and higher education, free student debt, but instead we escalate, and that's both parties. Mm-hmm. The current budget that is being negotiated, both parties are supporting an increased military budget that, as I said, only benefits the military-industrial complex. So I'm hoping that teachers and young people really are brought into the conversation on our show as to what they'd like to learn and what we'd like to really teach and encourage to produce the next generation of really social change agents. So that's one of my big appeals for the next couple of broadcasts. And I'm looking at, we've seen a lot about Russia, right? We're looking at impeachment, and it's about the Ukraine and giving them military aid to fight against Russia. And Russia's been responsible for dismantling democracy and invading our electoral system and so on. Well, I want to tell you who's been invading our electoral system and destroying democracy. Try gerrymandering and voter suppression that's going on in more than half the states in this country under Republican leadership. I'm not sure Democrats have also not done good, gerrymandering when they're in power. But that's the real threat to our democracy, plus the threat to freedom of speech, Trump calling all news, and this morning's Democracy Now! Had Bill Moyers, and I urge people to get on democracynow.org and see this morning's interview of Bill Moyers, in which he said the attacks on a free press are really extremely dangerous. The real fake news is coming out of Trump and Fox, but they're trying to intimidate, of course, and terrorize our press, which is very dangerous. So here we are, a break.
Yeah, this is Will's Wake Up Call on WCOM LP, Chapel Hill and Carver, 103.5 FM. You can stream us live at WCOMFM.org.
we can continue.
Are there any announcements?
Oh, yes, should I do those now? Okay, well, remember, I'm trying to put Palestine in context, and there are struggles going on, so I want to make an announcement that tomorrow, that's Thursday, and I hope I have it, there is a demonstration in Durham at 6 o'clock at, give me a minute, at, it's at 6 o'clock, at, what's it called, Bull Plaza, which is on Corcoran Street. We've been there before, so let me give you this. 201 North Corcoran Street. You'll see people there. It's where the big bull sits in Durham. Not hard to get to. We are carpooling, folks interested, but this is to protest the coup in Bolivia and the U.S. And CIA complicity. And one can have, discussions about Bolivia and Evo Morales, but the coup was clearly instigated and supported, the military, by the CIA. So it's tomorrow at 6 o'clock, that's one. And then, of course, we're also trying to, I talked to you about the Palestinian children in cages. I want to talk to you about the farm laborers and the Farm Labor Organizing Committee and APOYO. So let me start with APOYO. APOYO is a wonderful group. You can go, they should have a Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, APOYO. On December 2nd, they're going to have a community meeting. They're trying to bring all people together to support their efforts to protect immigrants who are facing deportation and ICE attachments. Attacks. They've been working with the sheriff's office so that they don't collaborate with ICE. That for a while they were letting them into the jails, and they've apparently gotten the sheriff's office to go back to what we've been pressing them to do, 7 of them around the state, to refuse to cooperate with ICE. That's going to be on December 2nd. We'll have an announcement on future shows. I don't have the location, but the support for APOYO is really critical, so I urge people to put December 2nd at 7 p.m. on their calendars, and we'll have announcements on future shows as well as on our Facebook as to where that's going to be. And then the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. Those have been 2 of Wilf's important labor struggles, and right now we are once again continuing, and there'll be more actions, but we're asking Circle K management to remove the Views e-cigarette from their shelves, to put pressure on Reynolds to sit down and negotiate a fair labor contract with the Farm Labor Organizing Committee that is representing some of the most exploited mostly immigrant workers, by the way, many of whom are undocumented. And
there was something that I read or heard.
I want to thank Emily for getting on this conversation.
That someone is not paying their workers. Do you know more about that, Miriam? Could you tell us?
I don't have the name of the farm. But there is presently a lawsuit against one of the farms that are part of the labor agreement that refused to pay its workers.
They named a person.
Yeah, he's also a representative. He's a Republican representative. He's either a representative or a senator. And remind me, because I'll get that information available.
Okay.
But I'll have to check with Locke. I think the lawsuit may still be pending. But this was actually an elected representative who runs the farm who was refusing to pay his workers. And by the way, they're also resisting or threatening the jobs of those workers who are trying to join a union. So we also have another event, and I think it's December 5th. Write it down. December 5th. I think that's a Thursday, but Raise Up 15, which is another major area of labor. And I mention this because this is worker justice. The first thing that's happening in this country, beside the military aid, is stamping out protests, calling news channels fake news, and then trying to kill unions. And certainly making life impossible for workers. And Trump may exclaim, the raise in employment, or the Labor Department talks about the raise in employment, but what kind of employment? Most of the employment the growth in employment is low-wage jobs where workers are refused the right to organize, like, multi-billion-dollar McDonald's and so on. So I want you to put down the date of December 5th, Raise Up 15 and a union. It's not just Raise Up 15, raise up for $15 an hour, but it's Raise Up 15 and a union. And that's going to be on December 5th, and we'll have the location and more information. So I wanted to talk about, again, putting Palestine in context. We talked about elsewhere in the world, with the kind of wars that we're supporting, endorsing, and I mentioned specifically Saudi Arabia and the Bolivia coup and Venezuela. And I should mention, and again, Democracy Now!, one of the highlights I do want to mention, because it gives us hope, is Lula being released to mass support, and obviously would have won the election had they not manipulated his case and thrown him in jail. And now who do we have? Bolsonaro, who is another, Trump ally and an ally of Saudi Arabia. By the way, he was in Saudi Arabia, Bolsonaro, with Mohammed bin Salman, and guess who else? Jared Kushner. And I can't help but mention that at the same time Trump is railing against and used the Bidens, to fuel his re-election campaign and threatening Ukraine, for forcing them, either investigate or we won't give you the military aid to stop continued Russian incursions. But who's putting their kids, who's lining their pockets at taxpayer expense? Trump and his children. He's got Ivanka Trump in the White House and Jared Kushner, neither of whom have any kind of serious experience and are only there so they can, line their pockets. By the way, Trump has a hotel in Moscow and I believe in Moscow, or he's trying to build one, and one in Turkey. So if you want to know some of his allies, just follow the trail of Trump
Money.
hotels. But the other thing I think people have to look at, again, putting Palestine in context, is not only our foreign policy that has to be re-examined, but what we're doing here, our race and low wealth biased criminal justice system, the rise of the Klan. Wilf has been on the march both in Hillsborough and in Pittsburgh, challenging the Klan that were walking around. We have open gun laws in this state, and they've been walking around with open guns outside schools. So there's the Israeli military, right, in jailing protest and carrying guns around, terrorizing the population. And here we have, at the same time, the growth of the Klan right here, and terrorizing children, carrying open guns outside school buildings, which is really a catastrophic. And as Maya mentioned yesterday, war against workers, war against women, war against people of color. But as Maya mentioned, when she was arrested, who invaded the campus but the abortion abortion genocide, I think it was called abortion genocide, trying to terrorize women on campus. One of 3, I think Maya mentioned, are victims of sexual assault. And I mentioned, of course, the administrative, local and global. What's happening against the Palestinians by Israel is happening here against students who are protesting on campus, are being challenged and often arrested, like Maya, for exercising free speech and protest. And I want to end with the 16, and I hope Emily will help me out. It's really important that people get on the Sonia Haynes Stone Center website. or call them, and I probably have their number here. And the reason I say that is they are going to be videoing the whole symposium.
Yes.
You can see the speakers on their website, and that video will be made available. And I urge people to link on to the Sonia Haynes Stone Center website and support them. It would, they really need more support for this extraordinary Center of African American Studies. But this symposium is, as Emily can chime in, was really a remarkable group of scholars and an audience. It was packed, and the questions were good. And many of the questions, I want to focus on what I said earlier. Some of the questions, especially to Dr. Freddie Parker, we should have on the show. Freddie Parker. We've had him on. Well, we're putting him in touch with our own office of, that's another person we should have on, Dr. Lee Williams, who's the head of the Office of Equity and Inclusion, to transform it. And we spoke to Misty Williams, another important deputy superintendent in the school system, about how to bring some of this important history, our own very dramatic history. It didn't start with the founding fathers, most of whom were slave owners. I never studied that when I went to school, and I don't think my daughter studied it either. We picked it up ourselves. But 1619 was kind of an opening as to where we began. And the beauty of the symposium is it made a very systematic, deliberate effort to tie the Native Americans, the genocide of indigenous peoples, and the transatlantic, mid-Atlantic slave trade. And they estimate over 3 million died, and God knows how many arrived on our shores to face the destitution of slavery. But they brought the two together, and how they've really combined their liberation struggles. It was just amazing. But again, the questions to Dr. Parker was he said, how do we bring this history into starting in early grades, how do we bring this history into our classrooms? So we brought that to the attention of the Chapel of Carvo School District. I'm sure other school districts are doing the same thing. I didn't bring a copy of the symposium, I left that, but you can get a copy, ask for a copy of the symposium program, because on the very back they had an extraordinary speech by, I think it's Noelle, there's a middle name, Jones, in which she, maybe Noelle Hanrahan Jones, I don't think so, it's Noelle something Jones, in which she talks about the same thing. We need to rigorously reshape and transform our curricula so that our young people have a real history of this country and the kind of violence on which it was founded, and the important struggles that we have, for voting rights. I mean, women and people of color were not in the original Constitution. We had to add and fight and die for amendments that increased the vote and other major victories for democracy in this country. So all of that, I think we have a lot to teach our kids. So we're going to do a survey. I want people to know, those especially who are in our school district listening to the show, or have grandkids in the school district, that we're going to be doing much more interviewing of young people and what they would like to learn in the schools, what teachers would like to teach. They don't have to be fettered by tests. We're trying to give them wings to really expand and make an exciting place of learning and social change.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's it. Again, and we have some really, just want to go over some important announcements and actions you can take. So take out your pens and pencils. I didn't mention, by the way, and I do want us to be aware that the Dreamers, the case is up before the Supreme Court, and it is Trump's effort before the Supreme Court to end DACA, which was the deferred action for children arrivals, that would protect almost 800,000 young people who came here, brought here by their parents, running away from violence to protect their children. So I want you to pay attention to that. Let me go back to I want to mention Apoyo. I want to say a little bit more about Apoyo because that's kind of systemic abuse right here against millions of our undocumented neighbors who are working and paying taxes, who fled their country because of violence from regimes that we supported. And Apoyo is APOYO is really a terribly important organization that I'm proud we're part of. So take this down. Tasvir Shah, TASVIR, Shah, SHAH. He is an employer who has stolen over $3,000 from an undocumented construction team worker, the worker that's supervising the team, who fulfilled the contract, and this Mr. Shah is holding up the money, and the pressure has already begun to have some impact, but I want to give you his number. It is really important. And by the way, if you don't get through, you can text him. Just tell him that you're very concerned about this important worker. His name is Raul, by the way, and he deserves to be paid for the work that he completed, and it's a disgrace that this employer is holding up his money. The telephone number is 919-636-0974. 919-636-0974. And tell your friends, it is just a call. It is really easy to do, and it will stop. By the way, it isn't just Shah. It is happening all over. Wage theft is now becoming an epidemic, especially among undocumented who've put in labor and are being threatened because if they protest, the employers feel they won't protest because they're afraid of deportation. So it's just an ugly part of what's happening in our civil life that shouldn't be tolerated. The other thing is flock. And I told you about getting to Circle K. There'll be other actions to follow, but there is a president and CEO of Circle K stores, which are owned by Kouche, C-O-U-C-H-E, Tard, C-O-U-C-H-E-Tard. That's the corporation that owns Circle K. And the president and CEO is Brian Hanash, H-A-N-N-A-S-C-H, H-A-N-N-A-S-C-H, president and CEO of Couche-Tard that owns Circle K. And his number is, never think you're going to leave this show without things to do, 800-361-2612. Press 1 for English, then 2 for directory, and then just go right on to Brian and tell him it is a disgrace that Circle K continues to hold Vuse e-cigarettes produced by Reynolds Tobacco that's making billions in profits, but refuses to sit down and create fair contracts for workers and the right to join a union, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. And finally, I want to have everyone say hello and send solidarity greetings to our good friend, Lori Hoyt. You probably have noticed that she's missing as our wonderful MC, and that's because she fell yesterday and broke her shoulder, and so she really is having difficulty moving and is in great pain. So if you would just send greetings to Lori, and on your behalf, we will send greetings on the air. Lori Hoyt, feel better, get better quickly, come back next week. We look forward to having you back as our Wilf Wake Up Call MC. And Iris is going to repeat how you can access, right, the,
You can live stream us at wcomfm.org.
as well as the People's Channel and our wonderful YouTube.